Welcome to the StoryADay Podcast. This is Julie Duffy, encouraging you to be a writer today, not someday. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It's Julie here from the StoryADay Podcast. And this week, I would like to talk to you about a bunch of things. What's going on in your writing life? How's it going? Have you been writing? What have you been writing? Have any of the habits that we've talked about this month on the podcast helped you to build some more writing into your life? Is there anything you've tried? Is there anything you've abandoned? I would love for you to come and leave a comment at the blog post site, at the blog, storyaday.org, and just leave a comment on the entry for this episode, which is episode 153. So it's storyaday.org/episode 153. I'd love to get a discussion there going about what, as we approach the end of January 2020, you have implemented, what you have abandoned, what you are hoping, how you're feeling as we go into the rest of this year. After all the hype of new year, new decade, all that nonsense, and then we just get back to life as usual. So what little changes are you making to make this year the best writing year yet? One of the things that I've been doing is reading. Lots and lots of short stories. I joked with the Superstars group here at StoryADay that I would set myself a goal of reading 366 stories this year because it's a leap year and there's an extra day. And they, egged me on. So I'm doing pretty well with that goal. I'm not actually reading a story a day because that's not how I roll. But I am up to 24 stories for the month. And this is the 24th when I'm recording it. So I am keeping up and I'm doing it in a couple of different ways. It's a really interesting experience and it's changed the way I'm consuming stories a little bit. It's had a few effects. So let me tell you a little bit about what it's done for me and how I'm actually doing this. One of the things I'm doing to make sure I actually do this is I have a spreadsheet and I have a little Google form, which I have a bookmark to on my phone. So every time I read a story, I go to this little Google form on my phone and I enter in the author's name and title and a couple of notes about where I found the story, what I thought of the story. And I'm not doing a major review. Like at the StoryADay website, I have this feature called the reading room where I will analyze a story and think about it from a writer's point of view and say what I thought and what I can steal, in terms of, this was a great opening, let me analyze why that worked. I'm not doing that. I'm just, in order to get this reading project, to keep it a tiny win and keep it as frictionless as possible, I'm just writing down the author's name, the title. I'm trying to write down where the story came from so I can go back and look at it again. And I'm writing a couple of notes to just jog my memory about what I felt about the story as I was reading it, and maybe one or two details about what it was about so that I can remember it later. And then I'll go back into the spreadsheet periodically and I'll highlight the ones that I really liked. And the plan is to go back and read them again and analyse them and put that up at the blog. But for now, reading these stories faster than I usually do and in greater quantity than I usually do is a really interesting experience. And if you're on the StoryADay mailing list, you've probably had an email from me at some point talking about the Bradbury method, which was something Ray Bradbury talked about, where he said if you're ever stuck or uninspired, spend a month reading a short story, a poem and an essay every day. Like every day for a month, and he defies you to remain uninspired. And it's absolutely true. You can't read that much and not be inspired to write. So this is sort of a modified version of that I'm doing, and because I'm reading at such a great pace, I'm finding that I'm making snap decisions about stories. It's like basically my scale is I loved this, or meh, or ugh, hated this. And those are sort of the three judgments I'm giving everything. And it's really interesting because there's a lot of stuff in there that I ought to like. There was a story that was sort of winking at Doctor Who stuff, and it was, beautifully written with it had lots of things that I like about short stories. It wasn't super straightforward. There were gaps that I had to fill in for myself. It didn't tie everything up in a knot. Loads of things that I like in short stories, and I still felt meh about that particular story. Whereas there are other stories that I normally wouldn't like, stories that are navel-gazing and, contain a writer who lives in New York or a small town in New England. And I'm usually rolling my eyes at those kind of stories, but something about those stories works for me. So it's very interesting to be plunging into reading basically any short story I can find and get my hands on indiscriminately, like not judging them beforehand and thinking, will I enjoy this? Just reading them and moving on. And then looking back at my list and going, that's really interesting. There's stories in there by writers I love. And the particular story has left me meh. And there are stories that I didn't expect to love at all that I really did. So I will continue this experiment. I don't have definitive results for you, but I will tell you I'm enjoying it. And so I'll give you a little bit of my method. Apart from the spreadsheet, what I also have is I use Evernote, and occasionally I will go in there and make a list of stories that I want to read. Because maybe I'm browsing around the web and I'm seeing a list of recommendations, or I've just pulled a book off my shelf and scanned the contents and okay, I want to read that one, I want to read that one. So I'll make a list so that any day when I am stuck and resisting the idea of reading my story, I can just pull up that list and go, okay, I'll read this one. I don't have to search for. So what I'm doing is I'm doing what I've been talking about this month with the Tiny Habits idea, and I'm making it as easy as possible to read a story so that when my motivation is low, I will still be able to get to reading the story when I get that prompt from my phone, or when I, remind myself after lunch that I should be reading a story. So having that list is very helpful to reduce the friction and make me read it. Another thing that's making it easy for me to read stories is I'm using a lot of short story podcasts. So even if I'm out and about, in fact, especially if I'm out and about, if I'm in the car, instead of listening to the news or listening to some random podcast, I'm listening to a short story podcast. And two of my favourites are Selected Shorts, which comes from New York Symphony Space. They play them on various NPR stations, but you can get the podcast. They have the ones that they broadcast on the radio, and then they actually have a side podcast now called Too Hot for Radio, which is quite fun as well. Probably as long as you don't have small kids in the car. So that I'll be listening to Selected Shorts, and the other one that I really like is Escape Pod. Because as you know, I'm a science fiction fan, and that's a really good one. They've got a whole stable of podcasts. Escape Artists is the sort of overall production company, and they have a bunch of different podcasts. There's a horror one, and I think that's called Pseudopod. So there's lots and lots of short story podcasts you can listen to. I don't always love the stories on either of those podcasts, but because I'm listening to them while I'm doing other things, it doesn't feel like a complete loss, and I get less angry if I read a story that I don't like. If I carve out time and sit down and get my cup of tea and I sit on the sofa and I'm taking time away from everything else to read a story, I tend to be very impatient and angry with the author if I don't enjoy the story. So I find the podcasts really keep me reading. And yes, listening counts as reading, as long as you are actually listening. If it's just playing in the background and you're not listening, then no, that's not reading a story. But I am a big fan of audio content. I do find that I am very, very sensitive to the narrator. If I don't love the narrator, it's really going to impact the way I feel about the story. So there's one story that I listened to that I felt like I should have enjoyed and I didn't. And I've marked it in my spreadsheet as something to go back and find a written version of and see if I enjoy it more as a written story, because I just didn't like the narrator. Nothing wrong with her, just didn't like her. So there are some things I'm doing to reboot my writing this month. I have not been writing short fiction this month. I've been writing longer fiction, part of a novel in progress, and that's okay. That's my plan for this month. Next month, that may switch up a little bit. I do have this novel I'm trying to finish, so that will continue, but I think that reading all these short stories is definitely there's going to come a point where I just have to write. Currently, the New York Midnight short story contest is going on, and I know several people who are taking part this year. I am not, but good luck to everybody who is. It's a really fun experience. It's a little pricey, but you do get feedback from the judges, so I would put that on your radar to look out for next time it comes around. Other things I want to talk about today. I have a been posting some of my content to Medium. So if you are a Medium subscriber, or if that's a platform where you like to do a lot of reading about writing or about things that you're interested in, you can find StoryADay content at medium.com/StoryADayMay. That's also the Twitter handle. So I think Medium was originally connected to Twitter. I'm not sure if it still is, but the StoryADay Twitter handle is at StoryADayMay. So the StoryADay Medium handle also became StoryADay May. So you can find stuff there. I'm posting the weekly prompts there, and I'm posting a few other bits and pieces there. So if you read there anyway, if you want to follow me, that would be great. If you want to stop by and give any of the articles little claps, that's a Medium thing. So I'd love it if you did that. This year, as I've talked about before, StoryADay May is turning 10. We're in double digits. It's very exciting. So I'm going to be doing a bunch of things as yet undisclosed to hopefully, celebrate that. But I noticed this week that our friends over at DIY MFA, which I knew, are also turning 10 this year. So I'm thrilled for them. And I think Gabriella and I are going to do a couple of things together. I've invited her on the podcast, and I'm sure that we will be doing a couple of joint celebrations, because we very much launched around the same time, grew up together online, and have gone back and forward various times being each other's mentors and helpers and fans. So I'm hoping, first of all, happy birthday this year to DIY MFA. If you don't follow them yet, you should. And hopefully we'll be doing some partying together this year. I also have an exciting piece of news about the podcast. Very nice friend of mine has put the StoryADay podcast into the Alexa system as a skill. What this means for you is that you can, if you have one of those speakers, you can now just tell Alexa to open the StoryADay podcast, and the most recent episode of the podcast will play for you. There's also a function where you can tell it to play a particular episode. So if you know that you want to go back and listen to episode 151, you can just tell her to play that. I believe there's one step you have to take before this will work. That is to open up your phone or your device and go into the Alexa app and search for Skillz. So you go into the little hamburger menu, pull it down, and it says Skillz and Games. If you tap on that, you can search for the StoryADay podcast. It will pop up. You click on it and it allows you to enable that skill. That's a one-time thing that you have to do. I'm not sure if that goes away once the podcast has been around for a while, but if any of you feel moved to do this at the moment, I would love it if you would do that, because I think it helps people discover. The other thing that you could do for me is you could review the podcast in there, and that really, really helps other people discover it. So if while you're in there enabling the skill, you could give the podcast a little review, just one thing that the podcast has done for you, or StoryADay has done for you, or one reason why you look forward to the podcast every week, that would be absolutely fabulous. Huge favour, and I would really appreciate it. Likewise, if you're in iTunes and you want to review the podcast, that would be lovely too, because it just helps other people discover the podcast, discover the site. It increases our community. It increases, the number of people and the wealth of information that we get to share in the community. But enough about what you can do for me. Here's something I'm going to do for you. I am going to post a list of my 5 or 6 favourite stories that I've read this month, so that you can go and read some stories. And I am going to continue to post the writing prompts every week. I've got some other things coming up. February's theme here at StoryADay is going to be romance. But don't let that scare you off. It's not just romance in the soppy sense. It's all about getting emotion into our stories. And emotion needs to be in all of our stories, whether you are writing romance or whether you're writing adventure fiction or, blockbuster thrillers. There's almost always a little bit of romance, but there's always emotion. It's the thing that draws the reader in. It's the thing that really makes the reader care about your characters. So this month we're going to be talking all about romance, with a little wink at the end, because it's not really about romance, it's really about emotion. And the reason I chose romance for February is not actually because Valentine's Day is coming up, it's actually because the 29th of February is coming up. And I don't know if this is a universal thing, but certainly where I grew up, there was a tradition that the 29th of February was the one day when women could ask men to marry them. I mean, it had sort of fallen out of vogue by the time I came along, but it was a historical sort of tradition that on the 29th of February, women could propose to men, which is kind of hysterical. And when relayed to my young nieces, they sort of looked completely befuddled by this idea that they had to wait to do anything they wanted, which is fabulous. But I thought about that and I thought, it amused me. So since emotion is such an important topic in fiction, and it is something that a lot of us hold back from because maybe it's something that we're just not comfortable expressing. Maybe there's all kinds of reasons why it's difficult to get emotion into your stories. There's a lot of vulnerability. There's a lot of digging back into your own issues. So we're going to look into it this month. The posts will be about it. The prompts will be about it. I'll be doing some workshops with the superstars and things about that. So stay tuned for more about emotion. All right, I would love it if you came over to the blog at storyaday.org/episode 153 and tell me what you're writing, how it's going, how your habits are developing. I would love it if you went into your Alexa app and enabled the StoryADay podcast skill. Leave a little review while you're there if you can. And find me on Medium. And then if you go to the episode notes for this podcast, I will give you links to the 5 or 6 short stories that I've enjoyed the most this month. I hope you're feeling inspired to write. I hope you've made it easy to write. And I hope that this podcast is perhaps acting as a little prompt to tell you to grab your pen and keep writing. Thanks for listening. Why not come over to the blog at storyaday.org and check out this week's writing prompts and articles. And in the meantime, have a great creative week. And of course, keep writing.